Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video with me and my little bear helper who is quite tired, so she might be a little bit grumbly in this video, and if she is, I'm sorry. But it's quite late at night when we're filming this, but the inspiration struck me and I just kind of had to do it, you know? It happens. So, the other day I released a video in which I mentioned my love of Oscar Wilde, and while it was premiering in the chat, I mentioned like, hey, do you guys want to see maybe some kind of, I don't know, like short story analysis or something like that? And so many of you were like, yeah, let's do it. Coincidentally, maybe like the next day or a couple of days after or something like that, one of my friends, I was talking to him and he was like, oh god, yeah, I love Oscar Wilde. And I was like, me too. We ended up like gushing over our just like unapologetic adoration of him. Shout out to Charles, by the way. He makes great music. Go listen to him. So I figured that's kind of like a sign. I need to talk about Oscar Wilde. So I sat down and I was like, maybe I can make a video. And I just like bashed out 9 pages of like analysis notes in a couple of hours. So let's do this. I am very, very, very excited for this one, which is why I'm bouncing like a child. And I honestly think Oscar Wilde may be one of my favorite writers, authors of all time. Just, oh my god, his short story collections are ones I go back to time and time and time again and just read over and over. His work at times, despite working like mostly in prose, is almost poetic or lyrical. It's beautiful, the imagery is gorgeous, but it manages to be so lovely without being pretentious. I love how often his style mimics but almost parodies old fairy tales, which you know I'm a huge fan of. I've spoken about it in many videos. And I honestly think his stories are some of the most emotional and moving, but also smart and funny that I've ever read. Today I want to share one of my favourite stories of his with you, which is The Nightingale and the Rose, and kind of talk a little bit about what it means to me, how we might be able to interpret it, and then I'm going to open the floor to you guys, and I want to know, what do you think this story is about? What does it mean to you? With stories like this, they're often quite ambiguous, they're quite open-ended. Like with a lot of poetry, your own life experiences definitely alter how you view or interpret or analyze a piece of writing. And this is one of the kind of pieces of writing, this is one of the short stories that I think your own life really influences how you view the work, which is why for everything that I talk about, I want to hear your thoughts. I want to know how you read into something, how you see it, what you think it's about. I'm probably rambling. Let's just jump into it. The reason I want to speak about The Nightingale and the Rose first is because not only is it my favourite story, but it gives you so much to think about. The differences between true love and lust, between love and infatuation, sacrifices going unacknowledged, conditional versus unconditional love, rational and logical versus arts and emotions, materialistic values versus emotional values, the whole process of creating art and what it means. And on that note, it's worth noting that Wilde was said to have been inspired to write this after reading Hans Christian Andersen's story The Nightingale, but regarding it as too sentimental. He thought it was kind of like mushy and too idealistic and meh meh meh. The Nightingale and the Rose, Wilde's story, is almost diametrically opposed to Andersen's in terms of the messages it portrays and the values it portrays, and I can hear you snoring, baby. You guys are gonna love hearing that, right? I'd argue that while on the surface, Wilde's message, Wilde's values, Wilde's story appears more cynical, I actually kind of prefer it, especially when it comes to talking about art itself, because Wilde tends to write about how creating art and even showing love and showing emotion is in itself important. The act of creating is what's important. It doesn't need a result. It doesn't need to be reciprocated. It doesn't need to be given monetary value. It doesn't even need to be acknowledged. It's the act of creating which is important. Andersen's story focuses more on the outcomes and on people placing value on art, whereas Wilde places the value on the process of creating, which is something I can definitely get behind. So, let's jump into the story. In the opening scene, a young man is crying that the object of his affections, this girl, has promised to dance with him at an upcoming ball if he can bring her a red rose. Problem is, he can't find one in his garden. Wilde writes that his beautiful eyes filled with tears, On what little things does happiness depend? I have read all that wise men have written, and all the secrets of philosophy are mine. Yet for want of a red rose is my life made wretched. So melodramatic, I love it. This opening is incredibly significant because we learn several things, right? This young man, this student, is clearly smart, clearly educated, and beautiful as well. But that's not enough for this woman that he clearly has some kind of feelings for. She demands something else, a red rose. And now we have to kind of ask, what is this red rose a symbol of? And throughout the story, kind of what you think it means might change, and you might have different opinions. Is the rose there as a symbol of her placing too much value on material possessions? Is she that shallow? Or is the rose a symbol of something natural yet beautiful? Is it there to symbolize that this woman only wants a love that grows naturally and can't be forced? Who knows? Like I say, as the story goes on, we get different ideas, but for now it seems that in one way or another, the red rose is this symbol of love, of true love, of ideal love, you know? I also want to draw your attention to the student's opening line when he complains about not being able to find the rose, because he states, "In all my garden, there is no red rose." And I find it very significant that he's only looking in his own garden, because again, this tells us something about the kind of love that he feels for her, and that maybe she feels for him as well. You know, this will become more significant later, we'll talk about this more in a bit, but it's worth noting that he's not exactly exerting himself in any way for this girl. He's not making an effort when it comes to love, right? If he truly loved her, as he's acting like he does, surely he'd look further for this red rose he really, really needs, further than his garden wall, you know? Wouldn't you travel to the ends of the earth for true love, for real, magical, special love? Meanwhile, as this guy is in his garden crying, a nightingale is listening in, and she's actually quite impressed by this young man. She says, "Here at last is a true lover. Night after night I have sung of him, though I knew him not. Night after night I have told his story to the stars, and now I see him. His hair is dark as the hyacinth blossom, and his lips are as red as the rose of his desires. But passion has made his face pale ivory, and sorrow has set her seal upon his brow." Now, nightingales, for one thing, are super important and super significant in literature. For hundreds of years in stories and poetry, nightingales have been used by everyone from Homer to Chaucer to Shakespeare to T.S. Eliot. They've all written about nightingales at some point in one form or another. Their songs are thought to be creative and passionate, but often full of sorrow, and that's no exception here. In Wilde's story, the nightingale sings a song about a man suffering for love, and it's almost like she feels like she's sung him into existence because suddenly he's here in front of her. And I guess that's another thing that I hadn't really thought of before. See, I have this bit at the end of this video where I want to talk about how every time I read this story it has like a different interpretation, and even now going through this filming, stuff that's not in my notes are coming to mind. Sorry about the air freshener. Like the fact that she thought she'd essentially sung him into existence. There's a bit I want to talk about earlier where I feel like perhaps the nightingale is meant to be this symbol of Jesus. Jesus being one form essentially of the Holy Trinity of God, and therefore the nightingale feeling she's sung this man into existence could somehow be allegorical or symbolical of God supposedly creating men and everything on earth. I don't know, that's just something I'm kind of like coming to now and thinking about it. Wilde was a theist, he did believe in God, so there may well be religious imagery like this in his work. Just because I'm an atheist, it doesn't mean I can't appreciate it and note it and, you know, see it for the beauty that it is. Anyway, moving on, I want to draw your attention to the absolutely beautiful, vivid, yet juxtaposing imagery that's in this little description of the man here, right? His hair is as dark as the hyacinth blossom, and his lips are as red as the rose of his desires, but passion has made his face pale ivory. Beautiful, I love it. And this is really, really interesting for a whole bunch of reasons, and this is what I mean. When you peel back the layers and layers and layers in Wilde's writing, you just find more and more and more, and it's incredible. First, let's take a look at that hair as dark as hyacinth blossom line, right? Hyacinths, I don't know if you know much about plants and flowers, but my dad is really into his gardening and I grew up surrounded by flowers. My bedroom window was constantly full of like little seedlings growing and plants and God knows what else. Anyway, hyacinths are normally pink or purple or blue or white, basically light pastel colours, right? But very, very rarely they can be dark, almost black. So Is this suggesting that the man's hair is kind of rare or special in some way? Maybe. However, it's also worth noting that plants often, especially in kind of folklore and traditions and all sorts, plants tend to have meanings, right? And while a hyacinth's meaning can change depending on their colour, generally they're thought to represent rash or passion-driven behaviour, or to engage in a game or sport of some sort, right? Apply that to the story. Is this suggesting that the man, by declaring his love for this woman and looking for a red rose and going out there and, you know, chasing love, is he acting rashly or passionately, or trying to play some sort of game or follow some sort of rules to, you know, ensnare a lover? I don't know. Also worth noting that in some cases, hyacinths can also represent sorrow and regret. Either way, a very fitting choice for this story. Next up in the description we get his lips being as red as the rose of his desire, and I think this is pretty straightforward, it's very recognisable. You guys get that. I don't need to explain this to you, you're smart. However, contrast all of that with his passion making his face pale like ivory, and that's such an intriguing image to me, because normally when you think of passion, you think of reds and pinks and warm colours, you think of blushing cheeks and a rosy glow. You don't necessarily think of skin pale as ivory. That kind of implies coldness, loneliness, death perhaps. So that comparison there, that kind of juxtaposition of passion and ivory kind of really stands out to me and says a lot. To move on a little bit, the student cries a little more, and the Nightingale, in this wonderful act of both foreshadowing and wisdom, declares, "Surely love is a wonderful thing. It is more precious than emeralds and dearer than fine opals. Pearls and pomegranates cannot buy it, nor is it set forth in the marketplace. It may not be purchased of the merchants, nor can it be weighed out in the balance for gold." And one thing I want you to notice here, as well as these like wonderful descriptions and everything, is this capitalization of love, almost giving it a godlike quality, you know, treating it with respect, showing its importance. This isn't just love, this is love. Love. I got really northern then, didn't I? I even love the descriptions that the student gives as he like wallows in the garden in his self-pity, right? He's like this typical angsty, love-struck teenager, but he's so melodramatic, especially in like the language that Wilde uses. It's so reminiscent of like really whimsical fairy tales, it's fantastic. "The musicians will sit in their gallery," said the young student, "and play upon their stringed instruments, and my love will dance to the sound of the harp and the violin. She will dance so lightly that her feet will not touch the floor, and the courtiers in their gay dresses will throng round her. But with me she will not dance, for I have no red rose to give her." It's so angsty, I love it, I love it. I also find that with Wilde's writing, it just flows so beautifully and so naturally that it just feels like poetry, you know? There's a definite rhythm to it, which I find really like draws me in and like engrosses me in the story. It's like you pick up one of Wilde's short stories and suddenly you're at the end. You're just carried through it effortlessly. A beautiful man was a genius. And, oh my god, and then the story with this over-dramatic flurry, right? The man literally flung himself down on the ground and buried his face in his hands and wept. I love it. He's not the stereotypical super masculine kind of hero that you get in fairy tales. He's quite emotional. He's a little dramatic. You know, he throws himself down on the ground. He weeps and he cries. You know, he's not out there actually acting and doing something, you know? It's quite interesting, quite refreshing. In the garden, all these kind of animals and creatures and living things are watching him, right? You get a lizard, a butterfly, a daisy, and they don't understand why the student is crying. But the Nightingale does, and she decides to act. Wilde writes that the Nightingale understood the secret of the student's sorrow, and she sat silent in the oak tree and thought about the mystery of love. Suddenly she spread her brown wings for flight and soared into the air. She passed through the grove like a shadow, and like a shadow she sailed across the garden. So already we're seeing this difference in the actions of the student and the Nightingale. She, because of her actions, or not even her actions, but because of her action, showing any action at all, unlike the student, because of that she seems to believe more in love, this capital L love. And she seems to believe more in this particular young man's love as well than even he does, because she's willing to travel, she's willing to search, she's willing to work for it. She's putting in the effort. She's demonstrating more love than this boy waiting around and rolling around on the floor of his garden, you know? To me, this is a great statement about how love isn't just passive. It's not just something that happens. Real love is something you have to search for and work for, but it's also something that you shouldn't just expect to come to you. But it's also something that you probably don't want to just pass by when you think there might be a chance of it, you know? So the Nightingale goes off to find a rose, and in typical fairy tale slash fable slash myth style, it takes 3 attempts to find the rose. And this is something that you'll have definitely seen, even if you haven't explicitly noticed it. But you'll notice patterns of 3 in these kinds of stories, right? It's a very effective way of storytelling. It's been used and implemented for literally thousands of years. You know, it's a great way of conveying information. It's kind of rhythmically satisfying to the reader. Yeah, it just works. You'll see it a lot in tons of stories. Look at The 3 Little Pigs. Look at biblical parables like the Good Samaritan. That was a bit of a tongue twister for me. That took a few takes to say that, I'll be honest. In which, you know, 3 strangers pass this man and it's only the final one that helps him. Look at the story of Rumpelstiltskin and the 3 times he has to spin the straw into gold for the maid, and on the 3rd time he asks for her baby, you know? And this is no exception, right? This story. So first the Nightingale goes off and she finds a tree, a rose tree, standing at the centre of like this big lawn, and she offers it her sweetest song for a red rose. But the tree replies, "My roses are white as the foam of the sea, and whiter than the snow upon the mountain. But go to my brother who grows round the old sundial, and perhaps he will give you what you want." I think it's worth noting at this point, A, how beautiful that description is, and B, flower meanings again, right? And this might sound kind of wishy-washy, but I think there is something in it. And when it comes to, like, I guess analysing literature, it doesn't matter so much if these things are real or not. Like, when I mentioned the biblical references and stuff like that, it doesn't matter if we think God is real. What matters is that that's what the author intended, and that's the importance he's putting into this story, and that's what we can learn and take from it. It doesn't matter if, you know, roses really have anything to do with love. It matters that humans have applied that value to it, and so now roses do symbolize love because we've applied that value to it, and so on. So let me just talk about kind of flower meanings for a second, because with roses, again, different colours of roses tend to have different meanings. And when I say meanings, I mean these are values that humans have applied to them, and these are things where, like, often if you want to say something to someone, you give them a certain flower. And so with using different coloured roses in this story and mentioning other flowers, I don't think it's coincidence or chance. I think Wilde was trying to convey these certain meanings. So the red rose that the Nightingale is looking for is clearly signifying this capital L, love. Whereas white roses in general, traditionally, are supposed to represent innocence and purity, which is quite obviously not what this lust-filled young man is after. So the Nightingale has to say, no, sorry, don't want a white rose. The girl doesn't want a white rose. The man doesn't want a white rose. No one wants innocence and purity in this story. And you know, who can blame him? So next the Nightingale goes to the rose by the sundial. But again, this one says, no, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And it tells her, my roses are yellow as the hair of the mermaiden who sits upon the amber throne, and yellower than the daffodil that blooms in the meadow before the mower comes with his scythe. But go to my brother who grows beneath the student's window, and perhaps he will give you what you want. Incredibly interesting couple of lines here. Oh my god, this is what I love about Wilde's writing. Like, on the surface level, it's fun and interesting and beautiful, but the more layers you pull back, the more you find. And just, he manages to convey so much information in so few words, and it's so beautifully written. And there's just, to me, that is poetry. That is what good poetry is. Even though this is prose, it's poetry. Do you know what I mean? Just watch my other poetry videos, you'll see what I mean. Kind of, probably. Yes. So, yellow roses. For one thing, these are supposed to represent friendship. You give a yellow rose to a friend to say, hey, I'm your friend. Again, this is obviously the wrong rose, because that's not what this man wants. He doesn't just want to be this girl's friend. And this girl isn't just looking for a friend either. She is looking for, you know, a man. She's looking for a provider, probably. Whatever. You know what gender roles were like back then. So obviously, yellow flower, not enough. You know, she's like, no friendship, give me the love. Sounds a bit... However, what's interesting about this bit is I find the similes used, these images he creates, the descriptions, are also really revealing. The reference to a mermaiden who sits upon an amber throne tells us a lot, because mermaids were traditionally thought to be seductive and dangerous. Interesting. While the daffodil that blooms in the meadow before the mower comes with his scythe is definitely foreshadowing for what happens later in the story, and may well be a message about how even beautiful things are often cut down in favour of practicality and making money, which is a huge shame. And let's finally note how the tree that the Nightingale is after is right under the student's window. It was there all along, and he didn't even know or notice or bother to try to find it or look at it or pay attention to it. And again, that says a hell of a lot about his love and how legit it might be. And it says a lot about everything, you know? So the Nightingale goes back to that tree, and the rose tree, and she asks for a red rose again in return for her sweetest song. And the tree replies, "My roses are red as the feet of the dove, and redder than the great fans of coral that wave and wave in the ocean cavern. But the winter has chilled my veins, and the frost has nipped my buds, and the storm has broken my branches, and I have no roses at all this year." "One red rose is all I want," cried the Nightingale. "Only one red rose. Is there no way by which I can get it?" "There is a way," answered the tree, "but it's so terrible that I dare not tell you." And this is where, in the story, things get kind of intense, I'll be honest, but this is what makes it so interesting, right? "If you want a red rose," said the tree, "you must build it out of music by moonlight and stain it with your own heart's blood. You must sing to me with your breast against the thorn. All night long you must sing to me, and the thorn must pierce your heart, and your lifeblood must flow into my veins and become mine." So if we remember that this story isn't just about, you know, literally about love, but it's also an allegory for art and the artistic process, this becomes even more revealing, right? How many of us here have hurt or suffered for our art? How many of here have taken our pain and our suffering and turned it into something beautiful? How many of us have embraced pain that we'd honestly rather not face and harnessed it and turned it into something incredible, something artistic, something we could share with the world? That's what's happening here. So the Nightingale considers this. She says, "Death is a great price to pay for a red rose, and life is very dear to all. It is pleasant to sit in the green wood and to watch the sun in his chariot of gold and the moon in her chariot of pearl. Sweet is the scent of the hawthorn, and sweet are the bluebells that hide in the valley and the heather that blows on the hill. Yet, love is better than life. And what is the heart of a bird compared to the heart of a man?" So to bring this back to love and the love interpretation, the use of images like chariot of gold and chariot of pearl are a clear indicator of the importance of love and relationships over any kind of material good, you know? But when it comes to Wilde's statements about art and what he's trying to say about the artistic process, I would suggest that the statement here that love is better than life is about how creating art is so important because it lives on so much longer after our deaths, after we're gone. Even when we're not here anymore, our art, our impact on the world is going to remain, it's going to thrive, it's going to live longer than we ever could. Us creating art is just so much more than us as individuals living a physical life, you know? So after talking to the tree, the Nightingale returns to the student, basically still lying on the floor. He's just stopped crying, but there's still tears in his eyes. And she tells him, beautiful little speech, "Be happy. You shall have your red rose. I will build it out of music by moonlight and stain it with my own heart's blood. All that I ask of you in return is that you will be a true lover, for love is wiser than philosophy, though she is wise, and mightier than power, though he is mighty. Flame-coloured are his wings, and coloured like flame is his body. His lips are sweet as honey, and his breath is like frankincense." Again, I kind of see these biblical references in the Nightingale saying, "I'm going to give up my life for you, all you need to do is love others," is kind of like the biblical teachings about Jesus, right? In the stories, he gave up his life for people so they could go on and love others and help others and so on. While I don't think that's historically accurate, I still think it's a lovely story and sentiment and something we can learn from, you know, like any fairy tale or fable. I love the lines about how love is wiser than philosophy, because I know a lot of people some YouTubers, who care a lot about the philosophy, the rational, the facts, and they don't care so much about the human element, the element of love and compassion, you know? Without love, without feelings, without compassion, without our relationships with others, what does any kind of rationality or logic or understanding of the world really matter? We can debate philosophy all we want, but until we put it into practice with actual human people, what does it matter? And the line about love being mightier than power, I love that bit, because regardless of what kind of power it is, physical strength, money, political power, just psychological, whatever, love is more important and more influential than all of them. And I think that's something really important to remember, you know? Oh, I'm sorry, baby. I didn't mean to make you jump. I was just talking about love and I thought of you. I love you. I'm sorry, my baba. I also find this line really interesting about love being said to have flame-coloured wings, because that invokes these images of, like, passion and how love can take you to amazing places, right? Love has lips sweet as honey because it's naturally sweet and lovely and nourishing and it doesn't go bad. Love's breath is like frankincense. This one, again, I can't help but hear the biblical reference. Frankincense was supposedly a gift given to Jesus as a baby. So comparing love and the act of giving love to, you know, something that was supposedly given as a gift to the Son of God makes it somewhat divine, doesn't it? The act of loving suddenly becomes divine, it becomes important. I want to also reference at this point Wilde's views on religion and spirituality, because he wrote quite a lot on it and there's a lot of really interesting stuff out there. But one article summarised his views by saying that Wilde thought, Christ is the supreme romantic artist, a poet who makes the inward outward through the power of the imagination. Wilde goes even further, saying that Christ makes himself into a work of art through the transfiguration of his suffering in his life and passion, which seems incredibly relevant here to our interpretations of this story, right? So the story continues, and sadly at this point, after this beautiful declaration of I'm going to help you from the Nightingale, the student looked up from the grass and listened, but he could not understand what the Nightingale was saying to him, for he only knew the things that are written down in books. So perhaps this is a statement about how when you only focus on the rational and the facts, you kind of lose sight of the magic in the world. You don't have this faith and you can't, like, hear Jesus or whatever. I'm not a huge fan of that interpretation because, you know, atheist. But I see what he might be trying to say, and I think maybe the kind of interpretation I'd want to take from that is, instead of just trying to focus on the facts and logic all the time, maybe take some time off to listen to your instincts, your feelings, your gut. Take some time off to listen to what the world around you is telling you, and don't just rely on what you've read in books, you know? So while the student doesn't understand the Nightingale, the oak tree does, and the oak tree feels sad, for he was very fond of the little Nightingale who'd built her nest in his branches. And the Nightingale sings one last song for the oak tree. And ironically, as she sings to the oak tree, the student walks away reviewing her song. And this is such a little, statement on, critics of art and stuff like that, right? Oh, God. Wilde is so, snarky and just on point. Oh my God, I love him, sorry. Okay, so the student walks away and says, "She has form," he said to himself as he walked through the grove. "That cannot be denied to her. But has she got feeling? I am afraid not. In fact, she is like most artists. She is all style without sincerity. She would not sacrifice herself for others. She thinks merely of music, and everyone knows that the arts are selfish. Still, it must be admitted that she has some beautiful notes in her voice. What a pity it is that they do not mean anything, or do any practical good." Oh my God, I love it. So this is obviously a statement about people who focus more on perfecting like the rules of a craft than creating something meaningful. And the irony here is that the student is completely misunderstanding the Nightingale song and her reason for singing, and God, the pure emotion that is behind it, you know? He simply can't see how much meaning and feeling and emotion is in that song. He's not hearing that she is going to sacrifice herself for not just someone else, but for him. It's saying, even when the critics are like, it's okay, that doesn't make art selfish, that doesn't make art meaningless, that the process is still important, the feelings you put into it is still important, even when other people don't see them, you know? So the student goes away that night, and the Nightingale returns to the rose tree. And I'm gonna kind of paraphrase the next section and just kind of, no, not even paraphrase, no, I'm gonna take chunks of the next section because there's some beautiful stuff in here, but it would take too long to read it all, and I do want you guys to go away and read the story for yourself and really enjoy it. Let me read you a few select bits. All night long she sang with her breast against the thorn, and the cold crystal moon leaned down and listened. All night long she sang, and the thorn went deeper and deeper into her breast, and her lifeblood ebbed away from her. She sang first of the birth of love in the heart of a boy and a girl, and on the topmost spray of the rose tree there blossomed a marvellous rose, petal following petal, as song followed song. Pale was it at first, as the mist hangs over the river, pale as the feet of the morning, and silver as the wings of the dawn, and the shadow of a rose, in a mirror of silver, as the shadow of a rose in a water pool, so was the rose that blossomed on the topmost spray of the tree. The Nightingale pressed closer against the thorn, and louder grew her song, for she sang of the birth of passion in the soul of man and a maid. And a delicate flush of pink came into the leaves of the rose, like the flush in the face of a bridegroom when he kisses the lips of the bride. The Nightingale pressed closer against the thorn, and the thorn touched her heart, and a fierce pang of pain shot through her. Bitter, bitter was the pain, and wilder grew her song, for she sang of the love that is perfected by death, of the love that dies not in the tomb. Again, biblical reference there. As the marvellous rose became crimson, like the rose of the eastern sky, crimson was the girdle of petals, and crimson as ruby was the heart. But the Nightingale's voice grew fainter, and her little wings began to beat, and a film came over her eyes. Fainter and fainter grew her song, and she felt something choking in her throat. She gave one last burst of music. The white moon heard it, and she forgot the dawn, and lingered on in the sky. The red rose heard it, and trembled all over with ecstasy, and opened its petals to the cold morning air. Echo bore it to her purple cavern in the hills, and woke the sleeping shepherds from their dreams. It floated through the reeds of the river, and they carried its message to the sea. I know it's kind of long, but like, just worth it, right? This whole passage not only tells us the story of different forms of love and how a relationship grows and blossoms and changes, but it shows us that the student was wrong. Art can be selfless. Art can and does change the world. And in this case, it did. It did have an effect on the world in some case. It created something beautiful, the rose. It was carried far and wide. It even made the impossible happen by making the moon stop in the sky. Incredible. And again, in reference to the religious connotations, which I kind of briefly stopped in the middle to mention because tomb, Jesus, you know, here you have a figure giving their life in sacrifice so others can go on and live and love and be happy. Like I say, Wilde was religious, and it's safe to say that this is arguably a reference to Jesus and his supposed sacrifice. And whether you believe that actually happened or not is irrelevant, because the meaning is still there and you still understand what it means to sacrifice for love from both of those stories, you know? So after this long, painful, beautiful sacrifice by the Nightingale, she's lying out dead on the lawn, and the student wakes, and he opens his window, and he sees the rose. "Why, what a wonderful piece of luck," he cried. "Here is a red rose. I have never seen any rose like it in all my life. It is so beautiful that I am sure it has a long Latin name." And he leaned down and plucked it. Interesting statement there about the "it's so beautiful, I'm sure it has a long Latin name," right? A statement, perhaps, about how, well, there's a hell of a lot that it could be in there. Maybe it's about how when we spend too long searching for the hows and the whys in science, we lose sight of the beauty and the magic and the wonder of something. I don't know, maybe that's what Wilde was going for, but I don't necessarily agree with or believe in that interpretation, so I don't like it. For me, personally, the meaning I find in this, and again, this is what I'm saying, because the story is so open-ended and ambiguous, you can find your own meaning in it, and that's absolutely okay. There's no one interpretation. So for me, when I read this line, I see it as more being about, like, a critique of man in general, as in humans, inserting themselves into nature. That's what I see this as. You know, like the rose is naturally beautiful whether man has named it or not. Just like it would be beautiful whether man had seen it or not. And it's a shame that the student can't see that, you know? Human beings tend to only find beauty in the things that they've inserted themselves into, and to me this line is a critique on that, whether that's what Wilde meant or not. And I mean, this makes sense if you're talking about it literally about nature, or if you use it as an allegory for art again, you know? Art can still be good and meaningful and important, even if you don't have people assigning names and values to it, you know? The process of creating art can be wonderful and can help people heal, it can help people feel something, it can be joyous, it can be wonderful. You know, you don't need someone to come along and assign a name to the piece or a valuation or critique it or review it or whatever, you know? So, back to the story. The student picks a rose and goes running around to see the girl, right? And in a traditional fairy tale, this will be where he presents her with the rose and she says, "Oh my god, thank you, I will dance with you at the ball tonight." And they go away and they dance and they have a wonderful night and they fall in love and they live happily ever after and pop out a million babies. This isn't a traditional fairy tale. This is Oscar Wilde. If that's the ending you want, maybe just turn off the video now, you know, just, you're good, I'll see you later. In reality, this is not a traditional fairy tale, it's more of a parody of a fairy tale. And in response to being offered the rose, the girl responds in a shallow, callous way by saying, like, oh god, let me just read you this passage. The girl frowned. "I'm afraid it will not go with my dress," she answered. "And besides, the Chamberlain's nephew has sent me some real jewels. Everybody knows that jewels cost far more than flowers." So here you have, like I say, shallow, callous woman placing more value on jewels, on material goods, than on love and sacrifice, you know? She's valuing aesthetics and appearance over anything deeper. And you know, this surface level of love, of appearance, of aesthetics is one thing, it's fine, it's nice. But that deeper feeling of love is so much more valuable and important, you know? And I do find that she's displaying some level of, like, naivety. So it's not just that she's callous and shallow. Maybe it is just naivety on her part, you know? She says, everyone knows that jewels cost far more than flowers. And yet, while jewels might cost more money than flowers, that doesn't mean they're more valuable than flowers. Value is so much more than money. You can gain value in so many other areas than just cash value, you know? There are different kinds of value, and the Nightingale made the ultimate sacrifice of her life for this rose. The Chamberlain's nephew, he just gave some coins, apparently, for these jewels. And I would argue that's nowhere near, on any level, as valuable as sacrificing your life, sacrificing your heart. Yeah, so I know it's like stating the obvious, but you know what I mean? Wilde is making the point that the girl is too shallow and naive to see this. And it's an important one because I think it's something that a lot of people today kind of not necessarily suffer with, but it's definitely a problem. People see value as being purely about money, purely about the material goods, and it's not. There's so much more to life. There's so much more valuable stuff out there that isn't just money. Oh, gotcha. And in the most ironic moment of this entire story, right, the student replies with, "Well, upon my word, you're very ungrateful," said the student angrily, and he threw the rose into the street, where it fell into the gutter, and a cartwheel went over it. And with that, he walks away, saying, "What a silly thing love is," said the student as he walked away. "It's not half as useful as logic, for it does not provide anything, and it is always telling one of things that are not going to happen, and making one believe things that are not true. In fact, it is quite unpractical. And, as in this age, to be practical is everything. I shall go back to philosophy and study metaphysics. So he returned to his room and pulled out a great dusty book and began to read. And so, in a brutal, heartbreaking ending that just the first time I read this, I was like, oh, hit me right in the feels. The Nightingale sacrifice, bless her, resulted in nothing. No one was rewarded, no one was even punished. No one got their wish. The Nightingale sacrifice was not even appreciated, never mind acknowledged or even known about, you know? Oh God, it's like life, isn't it? You know, it's this one big metaphor for life where you put so much effort into things and you do so much stuff and no one ever sees it. No one cares. It's a cynical look on life, isn't it? But at the same time, you know, the Nightingale, she sacrificed her life for something new and beautiful, and that is to be commended. You know, her actions over the boys anyway. The boy just ends up going back to reading dusty books, you know. He's simply learning and repeating what came before him. And yeah, okay, that's one thing, but it's nothing compared to creating something beautiful like the Nightingale did. But then again, we don't know if the student actually went on to be successful and the Nightingale is dead. So open-ended, ambiguous. We don't know who's really right and who's wrong because, you know, no one got what they wanted and the story is open-ended, and that's the beauty of Oscar Wilde. I mentioned this earlier, but as with many of Wilde's short stories and just his writing in general, the ultimate meaning of this is ambiguous, and you can kind of see what you want in it and you can apply your own life experiences to it and it changes the meaning, you know? I, as an atheist, don't necessarily see much value in the biblical allusions, or at least not as much value as a theist might, especially a Christian or Catholic or whatever. A pure, logical, rational person who doesn't really care for feelings and emotions might view the story and see the takeaway as, well, the boy was right to go back to science because, you know, that does have answers, that is rewarding, and unlike love, which clearly didn't pay off for anyone, it's good. Whereas a romantic, kind of like me, I guess, someone's been a romantic, might view the story and see how sad it is and heartbreaking and say, well, you know, yeah, the Nightingale sacrifice didn't pay off, but it just proves that the student and the girl's love wasn't the real thing. If it was, it would have paid off. The story is about demonstrating how people need to focus on love and the emotional, deep, important stuff instead of just materialistic goods and money. No, and that's just scratching the surface. There are a few interpretations. Like I say, there's so much more, and every time I come back to this story, I do see it in a new light. The first time I read this when I was a lot younger, when I was a teenager, I read it one way. When I was living with Dan and we were really settled and happy and we'd been together a few years, I read it another way. When I'd just broken up with Dan and everything was new and changing, I read it another way. And now, again, that I'm on my own and content and happy and my life is mostly focused on work and creating and art and just exploring who I am as a person, I'm reading it another way again. And I'm sure that in the future, every time I come back to this story, I'm going to see it in a slightly different way and I'm going to see slightly new things in it. And that's one of the reasons that I love not only this story, but all of Oscar Wilde's writing. Anyway, I've been rambling again as usual, but thank you for watching today. If you haven't read this story, I thoroughly recommend you go out there, do it, give it a read. It is wonderful. With Oscar Wilde's short stories, his writing in general, I really recommend you just take some time and enjoy yourself with it and really get lost in the stories, the language, the imagery, because there's so much you can get out of it, and so much you can get out of all his work. It's wonderful. And I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on your interpretation of this story and maybe some of his others as well. If you would like me to cover other stories of his, please let me know down in the comments. And also let me know which ones you want me to cover, which ones are your favourites. Let me know everything. I love reading your comments. Shameless self-promotion to end this video. I do have new merch available right now, including my hand-drawn octopus design, who I love. Oh my god, it's so cute and I love it and I had so much fun making him. So that is available now on t-shirts and hoodies and all kinds of fun things. And also, I have had so many submissions for you guys for the Fresh Poets Society, which is a series of videos I'm going to be doing where it's like a whole project, right? I'm going to be critiquing some of your poems on videos. Each month is going to have a different theme. The one for June is isolation, so you guys have been submitting your poems already. I've had over 100 from you guys, and they're incredible to read so far. And then all the ones that I don't have time to talk about in the videos, I'm going to be sharing on Instagram and in a document that's probably going to go on my website or Patreon or both or who knows what. Basically, I want to create a community where we can all help each other with poems and give each other advice and really build each other up, and it's going to be amazing. So you can submit your original work over at freshpoetsociety@gmail.com. The theme for now is isolation, so make sure your work fits that theme for now if you want it featured in the video, and the Instagram account and all the other stuff and words. And also, if you want to get involved, there is Fresh Poets Society merch available on my merch store, including stickers and hoodies and t-shirts and cute stuff like that. Okay, I'm shutting up. This has been long enough. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you guys so much. I love you lots. And I'll see you again very soon. My voice is getting very high. Wine. Excellent. I love you, Bean. You've been an angel through this. Isn't she a good girl? Like this video if you think Kara's a good girl.